I will never forget the sound. A sharp crack, a jolt that raced across my entire face, followed by a deafening silence inside my head. For a moment, I thought I had blacked out with my eyes open. Then the pain erupted, sharp and unbearable, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. The only thought pounding in my mind was, my own father just punched me. It wasn't a slap, it wasn't a shove. It was a full, deliberate punch, strong enough to shatter my jaw. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was what came after. While I was still trembling, struggling to breathe without breaking down, he calmly adjusted his shirt as if nothing had happened. And then, with a coldness I can still hear in my nightmares, he said, "Now go serve dessert." My jaw was fractured, my lips swollen, tears streaming uncontrollably down my face. And yet I was pushed toward the kitchen as though my suffering were invisible. That night I realized something terrifying. My entire family had been trained to look away. My mother pretended not to see. My brothers lowered their eyes. And me, with the tray in my hands, felt like an actress trapped in a cruel play. Each step toward the dining room was torture, not just from the physical agony, but from the crushing certainty that my pain had no place in that house. It's strange how the body keeps memories. Even now, the smell of freshly baked chocolate cake makes my stomach twist. Not because of the sweetness, but because that was the exact dessert I served that night, jaw broken, blood in my mouth, soul in pieces. And that is why I have to tell this story. Because silence almost destroyed me. Growing up in a house that looked perfect from the outside, but hid monsters behind its doors, leaves scars no one can see. From an early age, I learned to walk quietly, to measure every word, to predict my father's moods like a scientist studying an unstable formula. To the neighbors, we were the picture-perfect family. Sunday dinners, a neat lawn, smiling faces in Christmas photos. But inside, the truth was different. A constant routine of fear, tension, and forced silence. My father had a presence that filled every room. Tall, with a deep, commanding voice, he carried an authority that didn't need to be spoken. And when he was in a bad mood, the entire house seemed to shrink. My mother played the role of peacemaker, always smoothing the sharp edges of his anger. But that only taught us, the children, how to stay quiet. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and everything could explode. The night he broke my jaw wasn't an isolated event. It was the climax of years of smaller acts of violence, the kind people brush aside, the kind families bury under clean tablecloths and staged smiles. It was also the moment I realized my silence was destroying me. To speak out wasn't just a choice. It became survival. If you've ever lived something similar, maybe you'll recognize pieces of yourself in my story. And if you haven't, I ask you to stay until the end, because someone close to you might need this warning. This video isn't just a confession, it's a cry against silence. So if you believe voices like mine should be heard, subscribe to the channel, share this story, and help turn pain into courage. When I think back to my earliest memories, there is always a sense of tension in the background, like the low hum of electricity that never goes away. I remember sitting at the dinner table, fork in my hand, watching my father's face for the smallest sign of irritation. If his brow furrowed or his jaw tightened, my stomach would clench. It was as if the entire mood of the house depended on his breath, his tone, his silence. Other kids laughed at the table, spilling juice or dropping food. But in our house, a spilled drink wasn't just an accident. It was a disaster waiting to happen. My mother's role in all this was both confusing and heartbreaking. She loved us, I know she did, but her love was always filtered through fear. She would give us little signals at the table, a warning look, a subtle shake of her head to remind us to stay quiet. She spent more time protecting his temper than protecting us. And though I didn't understand it as a child, I grew up realizing she was surviving in her own way. Her silence was her shield, but to me, it felt like abandonment. When I needed someone to step in, she disappeared behind a practiced smile, one she wore like armor. There were small explosions that, in most families, would have been shocking, but in ours were routine. A slammed door, a fist pounding the table, a sudden outburst over something as trivial as the TV being too loud. At first, I thought every family lived this way. I thought dads were supposed to scare you. That fear was just part of the deal. But the first time I went to a friend's house and watched her father hug her after spilling milk on the carpet, I felt something break inside me. It was the first time I realized what I was missing: safety. Despite everything, there were good days. Days when my father smiled, when he played music while mowing the lawn, when he cracked jokes during a barbecue. Those days were confusing because they gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be normal. I clung to those good moments like treasures, convincing myself that the dark ones were exceptions. It was a cruel trick my brain played to survive, minimizing the trauma, inflating the calm. That hope was my lifeline, but it also kept me trapped in denial far longer than I should have been. The abuse wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was words, sharp and slicing, designed to make me feel small. You'll never amount to anything. Don't be stupid. No one cares what you think. Those phrases echoed in my mind long after they were spoken. They became a second voice in my head, one that whispered doubts into every achievement, every dream. When teachers praised me, I secretly believed they were wrong. When friends admired me, I brushed it off. My father's voice was louder than all of them, drowning out any sense of worth I tried to build. As I grew older, the stakes got higher. I was no longer a little girl he could control with a glare. I started developing opinions, desires, a life outside of his shadow. That threatened him. I could see it in the way his eyes followed me, in how he scrutinized my clothes, my friends, my choices. Every step toward independence felt like a provocation to him. And so the punishments escalated. What once had been angry words turned into harsher consequences, harsher blows, harsher silences that lasted for days. The walls of our house, once my only world, began to feel like a cage. The strangest part is how normal it all felt at the time. I didn't recognize the abuse for what it was. When friends asked why I never invited them over, I'd make excuses. My dad works late, or my house is boring. I never told them the truth because I couldn't even tell it to myself. Admitting it out loud would mean facing a reality I wasn't ready to accept. So I kept smiling, laughing at school, playing the role of the cheerful girl who had everything under control. Inside, though, I was unraveling, piece by piece. By the time I was in high school, I had mastered the art of hiding. I hid bruises under long sleeves, hid tears in bathroom stalls, hid my terror behind sarcasm. My friends thought I was strong, even funny, because I could laugh through anything. But they didn't see the nights I cried myself to sleep, or the mornings I dreaded coming home. They didn't see the careful calculations I made every day, trying to guess what mood my father would be in when I walked through the door. I lived in constant anticipation, like walking barefoot across shattered glass, never knowing when I'd bleed. And yet, there were still moments I craved his approval. That's the twisted part of it. Even after all the cruelty, I still longed for him to look at me with pride, to say he was proud of me. I studied harder, cleaned more, bent myself into shapes I thought would please him. But his approval was always out of reach, dangled like a carrot I could never quite grasp. That longing was the chain that kept me bound to him, even as the bruises multiplied and the scars dug deeper into my soul. Looking back now, I realize how carefully the silence was built around me. It wasn't just fear that kept me quiet, it was conditioning. My father taught me that speaking out was dangerous, my mother taught me that enduring was survival, and my siblings taught me that looking away was the safest choice. I became an expert at silence, at swallowing screams, at pretending I was fine. And it was this silence that made the night of the broken jaw not just possible, but inevitable. Because when silence becomes normal, violence becomes invisible, until it finally breaks through in the most brutal way. The night my jaw broke didn't begin with an explosion. It started the way so many nights did, with dinner. My mother had made roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and that chocolate cake she always baked when guests came over. We were hosting family friends that evening, people who believed we were the perfect, happy household. The table was set neatly, the silverware polished, candles lit. From the outside, everything looked picture perfect. But perfection was fragile in our house, and I could feel the tension crackling beneath the surface, waiting for the smallest spark. The argument began with something so small, it almost feels absurd now. I had laughed too loudly at something one of the guests said. That's all. A simple laugh, a moment of joy, and suddenly his eyes were on me. Cold, sharp, warning me that I had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. My heart dropped as soon as I saw that look. I knew what was coming, but I couldn't have predicted just how far it would go. The rest of dinner became a blur of forced smiles and tightening in my chest, as if my body was preparing itself for impact. When the guests moved into the living room for coffee and dessert, my father lingered behind in the dining room. That's when it happened. I was carrying plates toward the kitchen when his hand shot out and grabbed my arm. His grip was iron, and before I could even form words, his fist connected with my face. The sound was louder than I expected, a crack that seemed to echo through my skull. The pain was immediate, searing, radiating through my entire jaw. I staggered, clutching my face, the world spinning as if the floor had been pulled out from under me. I remember looking up at him through tears, expecting to see regret, shock, anything human. But his expression was flat, almost annoyed, as if I were the one who had done something wrong. My mouth filled with blood, warm and metallic, spilling down my chin. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The pain was so sharp I could barely move my lips. My vision blurred, and for a second I thought I might collapse right there on the kitchen floor. But then his voice cut through the fog, calm and commanding. Now go serve dessert. At first, I thought I'd misheard him. My brain couldn't process the absurdity of those words. I was in agony, my jaw possibly broken, and he was telling me to bring out the cake. When I didn't move fast enough, his eyes hardened. That look was enough. I knew resisting would only make things worse. So I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, grabbed the tray with shaking fingers, and forced myself to walk into the living room. Every step sent a jolt of pain through my skull. The tray felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The room was filled with laughter when I entered, but it died quickly when they saw me. I must have looked a mess, pale, trembling, lips swollen, a streak of blood still on my chin. My mother rushed over, her smile brittle, her voice high-pitched, as she insisted I had tripped in the kitchen. She's always so clumsy, she said with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't press further. I set the tray down, my hands trembling so badly the plates rattled. Not one person dared to ask what really happened. I remember the taste of that moment more than anything. Not just the blood in my mouth, but the sweetness of the chocolate cake mixing with it. Guests took slices, pretending everything was fine, pretending I wasn't standing there with tears in my eyes and pain radiating through every nerve. My brothers avoided my gaze. My mother's hand briefly brushed mine under the table, a silent plea to keep quiet, and I did. I smiled weakly, nodded when spoken to, and swallowed back my screams with each bite of sugar and blood. That night was the first time I understood just how powerful silence could be. Not only mine, but everyone else's. The guests didn't want to get involved. My mother didn't want to expose the truth. My siblings didn't want to draw attention. So the performance went on. We played our parts in the theater of a happy family, and I realized my pain was not just ignored, it was actively erased. That erasure hurt almost as much as the punch itself, because it told me I didn't matter. My broken body was less important than keeping up appearances. When the guests finally left, the house grew unbearably quiet. I thought maybe, just maybe, he would show some remorse. But instead, my father acted as though nothing had happened. He poured himself a drink, sat in his chair, and turned on the TV. My mother whispered that we would go to the doctor the next morning, but even then, her voice carried the weight of secrecy. "Don't tell anyone what really happened," she said softly, almost begging, and I nodded, because I didn't know how to do anything else. I was still a prisoner of his control, still bound by the chains of silence. That night, as I lay in bed with ice pressed to my swollen face, I realized the truth I had been avoiding for years. This wasn't just anger, or stress, or a bad day. This was violence. This was abuse. And if I stayed silent, it would only get worse. That realization burned in my chest, but so did the fear. Because admitting the truth meant facing a question I wasn't ready for. What was I going to do about it? The next morning, my face was so swollen I could barely open my mouth. Every movement sent sharp shocks of pain through my jaw, and speaking was impossible. My mother insisted on taking me to the doctor, though the urgency in her voice wasn't about my pain. It was about making sure the story held. "You slipped in the kitchen," she repeated like a mantra, as if drilling it into both of us would make it true. I nodded, too weak to argue, but inside I felt sick. Even with my jaw broken, the truth wasn't allowed to exist. At the clinic, the doctor examined me carefully. His eyes lingered a little too long on the bruises, his silence heavy with suspicion. "You said she fell?" he asked my mother, his tone polite but doubtful. She nodded quickly, her hand gripping mine tightly, not in comfort, but in warning. I tried to meet his eyes, tried to silently beg him to see through the lie, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. My father's shadow was too large, his power too suffocating. The doctor eventually sighed, wrote down the diagnosis, mandibular fracture, and handed over a treatment plan. No questions asked, no truth revealed. The weeks that followed blurred into a haze of painkillers, soft foods, and whispers. I couldn't eat without wincing, couldn't laugh without agony. But what hurt more than my jaw was the way the house carried on, as if nothing had happened. My father went to work, came home, watched TV, and carried himself with the same authority as always. My mother cooked, cleaned, and kept her voice steady. My siblings walked on eggshells, avoiding the subject entirely. I was left feeling like my suffering had been erased, hidden beneath the rug along with all the other broken pieces of our family. Friends noticed the change in me, of course. They asked why I was quieter, why I avoided smiling, why my face seemed tense. I told them half-truths: dental surgery, an accident in the kitchen, clumsiness. They accepted it, maybe because they wanted to, maybe because they didn't want to imagine something darker. But inside, I hated myself for lying. Every false word I spoke was like another brick in the wall my father had built around me, keeping me trapped in his story, his rules, his violence. Nights were the worst. Lying in bed, unable to sleep from the throbbing pain, I replayed the moment over and over in my head. The crack of bone, the taste of blood, the command to serve dessert. Each replay made me angrier, but the anger was tangled with fear. I wanted to scream, to tell the world what he had done, but every time I imagined opening my mouth, I saw his face, his cold stare, and I froze. Silence was survival, but silence was also destroying me. It was like drowning slowly, knowing the surface was just above, but too terrified to break through. As my jaw slowly healed, I realized something else. Nothing in the house had changed. If anything, my father grew bolder. He saw that he could break me physically, and still the world would cover for him. That power fed him. His voice got sharper, his control tighter. The message was clear. He could do anything, and I would remain silent. That realization carved itself into me like a scar, and I began to feel a shift. For the first time, I wondered if silence wasn't just protecting me. Maybe it was killing me. One afternoon, weeks later, I overheard my mother on the phone with a relative. She spoke softly, her words carefully chosen, but I caught enough to know what she was doing. Protecting him, excusing him, rewriting the story so the family wouldn't judge. "She's fine now," my mother said, her tone light. It was just an accident. Hearing her defend him, even indirectly, sent a wave of nausea through me. I realized she wasn't just afraid of him. She was invested in the illusion. She needed the story of the perfect family as much as he did, maybe because admitting the truth would shatter her too. I started to see everything differently after that. The smiles in family photos, the neatness of our home, the cheerful small talk at church, all of it was theater, a performance staged to convince the world that we were fine. I hated being part of that lie. Every photo, every laugh, every polite nod felt like a betrayal of myself. The more I played along, the more I felt like I was disappearing. I wasn't a person anymore. I was a prop in his performance, a puppet whose strings were pulled by fear. It was during this time that I began keeping a journal. At first, it was just scraps of paper tucked under my mattress, but soon it became a notebook filled with everything I couldn't say out loud. I wrote about the pain, about the anger, about the suffocating silence that pressed down on me. The words spilled out in shaky handwriting, messy and raw, but they felt like oxygen. It was the only place where my truth lived, where I wasn't clumsy or careless or weak. I was a girl who had been hurt and who deserved better. Writing didn't change my reality, but it gave me a flicker of control in a world where I had none. The journal also gave me something else, the first glimpse of a possibility I had never dared imagine, a life outside his control. A life where I could speak without fear, laugh without punishment, exist without shame. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. For so long I had believed escape was impossible, but now, with every word I wrote, I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, silence didn't have to be my destiny. And that thought scared me more than anything, because once you let yourself imagine freedom, you can never go back to believing the cage is all you deserve. As my journal filled with words I could never say aloud, something inside me began to shift. I started noticing the small cracks in my father's control, cracks that had always been there but that I had been too afraid to see. At school, I allowed myself to laugh a little louder. With friends, I let myself imagine a life where I wasn't constantly shrinking. These moments were tiny rebellions, invisible to most, but to me they felt monumental. Each act was proof that somewhere inside me, I still existed beyond his shadow. But rebellion, even in its smallest forms, rarely goes unnoticed in a house like mine. One afternoon, I came home late from a study group. I had told my mother where I was, but apparently she hadn't told him. When I walked through the door, his eyes were already waiting. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. My explanation didn't matter. To him, it was disrespect, defiance, betrayal. He slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the walls, and for a moment I thought he would hit me again. My jaw ached just from the memory, but instead of striking, he delivered something almost worse: silence. A silence so thick it crushed me, lasting for days, making me invisible in my own home. That silence worked like a punishment, but it also taught me something. If speaking out or living freely made me a target, then maybe silence wasn't survival anymore. Maybe it was surrender. My father's power didn't only come from his fists, but from the way he controlled the air we breathed, the words we spoke, the movements we made. Realizing this terrified me. But it also sparked a question I hadn't dared to ask. If silence kept me chained, what would happen if I broke it? I tested this idea cautiously. At school, when a teacher asked why I was struggling to speak during presentations, I almost told the truth. The words pressed against my lips, but fear swallowed them before they escaped. Still, the temptation lingered. I started spending more time with friends, choosing ones who radiated warmth and kindness, who reminded me of what safety felt like. Around them, I felt pieces of myself returning. The girl who loved to tell stories, who laughed with her whole body, who dreamed of becoming more than just someone's daughter. It was addictive, that feeling of being seen. Of course, my father noticed the changes. He noticed everything. One evening, he confronted me about a friend he didn't approve of, sneering at her family and calling her a bad influence. "You think you're better than us now?" he asked, his words dripping with venom. My heart raced, but for once, I didn't lower my gaze. "No," I said softly. "I just want something different." His face hardened instantly, and the air between us grew heavy, like the moment before a storm. For the first time, I saw not just anger in his eyes, but fear. Fear that I was slipping away from him. That fear made him tighten his grip. Rules multiplied. Curfews grew stricter. My phone was checked, my movements monitored. He spoke about respect, about family loyalty, but what he really meant was control. The more he tried to cage me, the more I felt the urge to push back. It was a dangerous game, one where the stakes were my own safety. Some nights I lay awake, torn between survival and freedom, wondering which would destroy me faster. The journal became my secret weapon. Every insult he threw, every rule he tightened, every bruise he left, I wrote it all down. Not just for me, but for proof. Proof that I wasn't imagining it, proof that this wasn't normal, proof that I wasn't crazy. The more I wrote, the more I realized I wasn't just documenting my pain. I was preparing for something bigger. Though I didn't know what yet, I felt it coming. like thunder rumbling on the horizon. But with each step I took toward independence, the danger grew sharper. One night, after he accused me of lying about a school project that had kept me late, the argument escalated beyond anything I'd seen before. His face was red, his voice booming, his hand clenched into a fist. I braced myself, certain the punch was coming, but instead he grabbed a plate from the table and shattered it against the wall, inches from my head. Shards of porcelain rained down around me, some slicing my skin. My breath came in short gasps as I stood frozen, realizing just how close he had come to destroying me completely. The days after that incident felt different. My siblings avoided me, whispering in corners, too scared to be caught in the crossfire. My mother hovered more closely, watching me with pleading eyes, as if begging me not to provoke him again. But something had changed in me. The fear was still there, pulsing in my veins, but alongside it was a new determination. He wanted me silent, broken, obedient. But the more he tried to erase me, the louder the voice inside me became. And yet, determination alone wasn't enough. I was still trapped under his roof, still bound by the illusion of family loyalty, still too young and powerless to walk away completely. Each day became a balancing act. How much of myself could I reveal without drawing his rage? How much rebellion could I risk before he snapped again? It was like living on the edge of a knife, every movement threatening to cut me deeper. I knew I couldn't live like that forever, but I didn't yet know how to escape. What I did know was that something inside me had shifted permanently, and there was no turning back. Because once you taste even the smallest drop of freedom, the cage becomes unbearable. The weeks after the shattered plate felt like living under a constant storm cloud. Every sound in the house seemed louder, every silence heavier. My father carried himself with the same authority as always, but I could feel the shift in the air. He was watching me more closely, suspicious of every move, as if he knew I was slipping beyond his control. I tried to shrink myself again, to disappear into obedience, but the truth was out. I couldn't unknow it. I wanted more than survival. I wanted freedom. My journal became my secret sanctuary, but also my weapon. I documented every incident with meticulous detail. Dates, words, actions, bruises. I didn't know if I'd ever be brave enough to show anyone, but writing it gave me a sense of power. For the first time, his violence wasn't erased. It was recorded. It existed on paper, undeniable. Each page was a step toward reclaiming my own story. And though it terrified me, it also gave me strength. Around this time, I began confiding in a teacher I trusted. It started with vague hints that things at home were complicated, that I often felt unsafe. She didn't push me, but she listened, and that alone cracked open a door I thought was forever locked. One afternoon, after class, she said softly, "You don't deserve to live in fear." Those words stuck to me like glue. I replayed them in my mind every night, letting them chip away at the voice inside me that said I was weak, worthless, unworthy. But secrecy and defiance couldn't last forever. My father found the journal one evening while searching my room. I'll never forget the way his face twisted as he held it in his hands, flipping through the pages that exposed him. For a moment, the world stopped. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would break through my chest. "So this is what you think of me?" he roared, his voice shaking the walls. He tore at the notebook, pages scattering like broken pieces of me. I thought he would hit me again, but instead he stood there, breathing hard, his rage simmering into something colder. Threat. "If you ever write about this again, you'll regret it." That night, I cried harder than I ever had before, not because he had destroyed my journal, but because I realized something vital. He was afraid. The pages scared him. The truth scared him. For the first time, I saw that his power wasn't absolute. It thrived only in silence, and silence was slipping away from me. If he feared my words, then my words were my way out. That thought was both terrifying and liberating. I knew then that I had to find a way to speak, no matter the cost. My teacher noticed the change in me immediately. She pulled me aside and asked directly, "Are you safe at home?" My throat tightened, fear rising like a tide, but this time I didn't lie. I didn't tell the whole story, but I gave her enough. Enough for her to look at me with eyes full of worry and determination. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. For the first time in my life, I believed her. Those words lit a fire in me. Small, flickering, but real. I began to plan, quietly, secretly. I saved bits of money from odd jobs, hid belongings in places he wouldn't think to check, memorized phone numbers I might need. Each step felt like treason, but also like salvation. I was no longer just enduring. I was preparing. My father sensed the shift, though he couldn't name it. His temper grew sharper, his questions more invasive. He knew control was slipping, and that made him dangerous. Every day felt like walking a tightrope above a pit, but I kept walking because the thought of staying trapped was worse than the risk of falling. The final confrontation came on a night I'll never forget. He accused me of lying about where I'd been, his face red with fury, his voice booming. The argument escalated quickly, and for once I didn't shrink back. "You can't control me forever," I said, my voice trembling but steady. The room fell silent, his eyes widening with shock. He had expected fear, submission, silence, but not defiance. That moment was a turning point. For the first time, I wasn't just his daughter, his victim. I was someone who dared to say no. The aftermath was explosive. He shouted, threatened, slammed doors, tried to intimidate me back into silence. But something inside me had broken free, something he couldn't put back in the cage. I wasn't fearless. My body shook, my heart raced, my mind screamed at me to back down. But I didn't. And that refusal, that single act of resistance, felt like the most powerful thing I had ever done. It was the first real step toward the life I wanted, the life I deserved. I didn't leave that night. It would take time, careful planning, and support I hadn't fully gathered yet. But in that moment, I knew leaving wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was inevitable. I had spoken the truth, even if only in my own house, and the world hadn't ended. He hadn't destroyed me. And once you discover that your voice can survive the storm, you can never go back to silence. The question that haunted me wasn't if I would escape. It was when and how and whether I'd survive long enough to tell the story. Telling this story has been like opening old wounds, ones I spent years trying to stitch shut with silence. For so long, I believed silence was the only way to survive. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I played my role, if I carried trays of dessert with blood in my mouth, then maybe I could keep the peace, maybe I could keep myself safe. But silence didn't protect me. It broke me. And the hardest lesson I've had to learn is that silence is its own kind of violence, because it convinces you that your pain doesn't matter. My father's fist broke my jaw, but his silence and mine almost broke my spirit. Every bruise, every cruel word, every time I swallowed back the truth chipped away at me until I barely recognized the person in the mirror. But I survived. I survived not because I was stronger than him, but because somewhere deep inside, I believed that my story deserved to be told. That belief, fragile and flickering, carried me through nights I thought would never end. The truth is, leaving wasn't simple. I didn't just pack a bag and walk away. It took planning, courage, and help from people who cared enough to listen. It took the bravery of a teacher who noticed the signs, the quiet support of friends who gave me a taste of safety, and the stubborn determination inside me that refused to die. I stumbled, I doubted, I cried, but step by step, I found my way out of the cage I was born into. And here's the part that matters most. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt trapped the way I did, know this: you are not alone, and your silence is not the end of your story. Abuse thrives in the shadows, but even the smallest whisper of truth can start to break the chains. You don't have to scream it to the world. Sometimes, telling just one safe person is enough to begin. Sometimes, even writing it down like I did can remind you that your pain is real and that it matters. To those who have never lived this, I ask you to listen without judgment, to believe without demanding proof, to see the signs that are often hidden in plain sight: a fake smile, a too perfect family portrait, a friend who suddenly goes quiet. These can all be cries for help. Don't look away. Don't let silence be the language of suffering. When I look back on the night my father told me to serve dessert with a broken jaw, I don't just see pain anymore. I see the moment that forced me to choose: keep living in silence or start finding my voice. It was the darkest night of my life, but it lit the first spark of freedom. And that spark is why I'm here, telling you this now, breathing, healing, still standing. If this story has touched you, if it's opened your eyes or your heart, I ask you to do one thing. Don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, and help me build a space where silence is broken and stories are heard. Every voice matters. Every story has power. And together, maybe we can make sure no one else has to serve dessert with a broken jaw, pretending everything is fine.